Cyber resilience, a term most had never heard of, in April of 2020. Then a pandemic hit. But Richard Clarke had already written a book about it, The Fifth Domain. In this throwback episode, Richard discusses the need for cyber resilience, especially these days. Significant cyber risks are still manageable, but remains contingent on a consensus that it is worth prioritizing. Where have we heard that before? I hope you enjoy this replay.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
All right, I've been waiting for this interview for weeks. We had to reschedule a couple times, but Dick Clarke is the founder and CEO of Good Harbor Cyber Security Risk Management, advises leaders in the public and private sectors on all issues of cybersecurity and crisis management. Dick served in the White House on the National Security Council under Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush for 10 years and is part of a special advisor to the president on cybersecurity. In his role as the nation's cyber czar, Dick developed the country's first national strategy to defend cyberspace. Since leaving government, Dick has authored or co-authored 9 books, including the international bestseller Against All Enemies, and his latest book, which we're going to talk about today, The Fifth Domain. Dick, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Great to be with you finally. I'm sorry it took so long. My fault.
Oh, no worries. I've got the book here. And I'm reading this book, and I'm looking at all the people you interviewed for this book, and I'm like, yeah, I know that person. Yeah, I know that person. I know that person. I've seen you speak a couple times. I was at the Global Cyber Innovation Summit last year. You spoke there in Baltimore, I think on aspects of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm really excited because this topic is really interesting to me, right? I mean, you identified the need to secure cyberspace really early on. Understood the implications not only to our country, but to companies. And you came up with this really interesting concept around cyber resilience. Before we dig into it, though, kind of give us a little bit of background on the precursor for this book.
Well, 10 years ago, my co-author, Rob Kanaki, and I wrote the first of our 2 books on cyberspace. That one was called Cyber War. It was 10 years ago. And in it, we talked about the threat of nation states creating military units that would hack in peacetime for profit, for espionage purposes, and in wartime for destruction and disruption. And I think it was Wired magazine that said, file under fiction. Well, so 10 years on, no one laughs at us anymore. No one thinks we were wrong 10 years ago. So Rob and I kind of thought, well, if nothing else, let's just write a book to say, we were right. But in the course of researching the book, we discovered we were also fundamentally wrong 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, we used Dmitry Alperovich's quote, there are only 2 kinds of companies, those who have been hacked and know it, and those who have been hacked and don't know it. We said any company could be hacked. And that may have been true 10 years ago, but it's not true anymore. And that's what we discovered in doing the research for this book. Now there's a third kind of company, the resilient company. And we wanted to know what was the source of that resilience, what made them resilient, and how many of them were there, and what fields were they in. And it's actually a very optimistic book in a way, at least with regard to this, because we say any company can get there. It takes 3 things. It takes a governance structure. It takes a culture of security permeating the company. And it takes appropriate spend. And appropriate spend, we found, is on the order of 8, 9, 10, 12% of your IT budget. And unfortunately, many companies are spending around 3 or 4% of their IT budget. And it's almost that simple. If you can find a company where the governance structure has worked to the point where they've approved a budget on the order of 10%, everything else has probably also been approved, and all kind of falls into place. And you get companies that go many years without a significant hack, or without a hack that either loses vital information or stops operations.
So the security vendors. Go ahead, Paul.
What I like about what you're saying is you can't just throw money at the problem. You need those other two elements. You need process and you need culture. You can't just throw money at the problem.
Yeah, but you usually get all three together, as it turns out. So the governance model means that the board of directors, the corporate board, has a member of the board who knows what this is all about. And that person typically chairs a cyber risk committee of the board. That person is typically the voice of the CISO, represents the CISO, also kind of supervises the CISO, a little oversight, but also represents her and argues on her behalf for spend. So that's at the board level. And then at the C-suite level, the CISO reports to somebody other than the CIO, or is a dotted line to the CIO and a dotted line somewhere else. Now that can be to the CFO, it can be to the COO, and it can be to a chief risk officer, but there is a built-in cultural clash between the CIO and the CISO. They have different objectives, different priorities. One thing we advise when consulting is that anytime a CISO asks for something and is denied, whether that's money or a procedural change, she should have the right to go directly to the CEO and inform him. Because so many times when we go into companies that have been hacked, in the after action, the CISO will say, well, if you'd only approved that widget that I asked for 6 months ago, and the CEO says, I never knew you asked for that. I wasn't the one who said no to that. I would have approved that. Well, they always say that after the fact. But if you can have a process where if the CISO thinks it's important, they can go all the way to the top, and that denial can be documented. That has a chilling effect on people who say no. It's like NASA. After the Challenger space shuttle blew up, they had a big study commission. And one of the things that they came up with, a recommendation which they implemented, was that any person in the launch center, anyone in mission control for the launch, could raise their hand and say, stop the launch. Well, it ought to be the same way here. The CISO ought to have that kind of authority to say, wait a minute, let's review that decision. Let's document that decision that you said no to this thing I asked for. So you get that governance structure right. That creates, inevitably, the culture that permeates every employee. That means they get the phishing training. That means they're told that it's their paycheck, their stock in the company that's on the line if something goes wrong, because the company gets hurt, the employees get hurt, the stockholders get hurt if the company gets hacked. And so everyone shares in that understanding and that mission. And then they don't complain when they're asked to do multi-factor authentication or something that's time-consuming or cumbersome. And if you have all of that in place, then when that request comes in for 10% of the IT budget to be spent in a planned multi-year way, a maturity program, technology maturity roadmap, then usually it gets approved.
Yeah, I like the NASA model. It reminds me of the famous Bill Gates email to all of the developers at Microsoft that said, hey, anyone can stop at any time. In fact, you should stop and focus on a security issue if there is one, right? And that's one of the things that was instrumental.
That only took Bill Gates 10 years.
Yes, well, it's true. A long time, yeah. And now they support open source, right? Which in the very early days was not what they did.
Oh my God! When I asked NSA to take Linux, open source Linux, and find the security flaws in it and publicly post them, Microsoft had a fit. I mean, they called my superiors in the White House trying to get me fired because I was undercutting Microsoft by supporting open source Linux.
Mm-hmm.
Dick, you identified three very interesting characteristics: a governance model, a culture, and a budget. My guess is the companies that meet those three are probably some of our highest regulated companies out there, the financials, the healthcare, et cetera. So the question I have for you...
Not healthcare. Not healthcare.
Well, okay.
But financials,
Yeah, the financials for sure. We've known that for a while. Healthcares have some of the regulatory places, the regulatory bodies in place, maybe not the teeth behind it. But I'm curious, outside of the highly regulated, how do corporations go about the governance, the culture, and the budget discussion so that we have more companies that can be successful from this concept of cyber resilience?
So it's outside of the financial sector, which is the most regulated. The next thing you find doing well is some of the aerospace and defense companies, which are also highly regulated by the Pentagon. The companies that are in sectors that are not regulated and nonetheless do well are entirely a result of individuals. So I'll give you an example. You might not think of Hyatt hotels when you think of the most secure companies, but they're damn secure. And one of the reasons is they meet all three of those criteria because the chairman of the board got religion. And the chairman of the board said to the CISO, I want to know you. I want you to report to me all the time. If you have any needs, I want you to tell me about that. And the chairman of the board told the CEO he was doing all of this. So the result was you got a pretty good spend. You got lots of innovative programs. And what we found was the case of NotPetya was very telling. In the case of NotPetya, lots of American companies that were in Kiev got hacked. But Hyatt was not one of them, in part because of this relationship the CISO had with the chairman.
Yes, but that's a one-off, right? When you think about that, is that you need how do you instill that across multiple organizations? Because if regulation's not there to enforce aspects of this, right? How do you get the rest of the industries and the companies to get to those same three characteristics? I don't know how you do it outside of individual one-offs here and there.
That's the only way. It's either regulatory on the one hand, or if they're in non-regulated industries, it's one-offs because some individual, the CEO or the chairman of the board, or just a member of the board, realizes it's important. The other factor that frankly occurs is they get hacked, and then they get religion. Right. Companies, if you look at the companies that are doing decent spend in non-regulated spaces, they've usually been hacked, and then they respond by throwing money at the problem, often without a systematic game plan for how to do so.
Yeah. I think it's chapter 8 of the book. It says cyber resilience, the best bad idea we've got. And I want to ask you a question. I was at RSA conference. I'm in one of the investor dinners, and they're talking about shared defense. Seems to be a discussion around the way we defend our country and our companies is this concept of shared defense. And I was the first one to ask a question. I didn't get the exact answer. I'm curious on your thoughts on it. What's the incentive for shared defense? Because if I think about the ISACs outside of the FS-ISAC, there hasn't been a lot of sharing. What's the incentive for companies to share information for this concept of shared defense over this concept of cyber resilience? I'm just curious on your thoughts because I saw this shift at RSA this year.
Yeah, I did too. And, in full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board for a company called TrueStar, which is designed to create shared defense and allows companies to share information with each other in an anonymized way. So you don't know where it's coming from unless the other company wants to tell you. Look, the reason is simple. The more sources of information you have, the more likely you are to know about a new vector, a new attack vector, in time to change before you get attacked. The beauty of Crowdstrike and other companies like it is that they take all the information from every one of their clients and pool it and send it back out and make adjustments on a real-time basis. That helps. Companies that have Crowdstrike or other products that have that feature set don't get hacked very often because they're ahead of the power curve. They know
Right.
When something new has popped up.
And I get it from a CrowdStrike perspective because they're monetizing that through their product. But what's the incentive for CrowdStrike to then share that information with somebody else when they're trying to monetize some of that data, right? This is where I see a potential flaw in the shared model, is that the incentives aren't there for some of the commercial vendors.
Well, that's true. And that's where companies like TrueStar come in, where anyone who signs up can share that information with anybody else in the group that they identified they're willing to. And so it's a common defense. So if you don't think you have enough information in real time coming from your vendors, then you can get it from your peers or your colleagues, and you can share your information too without putting your general counsel into a tizzy because you're sharing it on an anonymized basis.
Right. Yeah, I saw this, talk, and I was like, I get the concept. I love the concept. I'm just not sure how many people actually do it because it really takes away some of their advantage in being able to monetize their products. And
well, their products, yeah. But if you're a company like, let's pick a hotel chain like Marriott, you don't have a product you're trying to monetize other than the hotel service. Mm-hmm. And so if you sign up for something like TrueStar, then you're sharing their information anonymized with other companies. They're sharing it with you, and you're ahead of the game because you have more information in a more timely way.
Got it. So I want to bring in the current environment that we're in with all these quarantines and lockdowns, and kind of understand, what are we learning about cyber resilience in a non-cyber incident, right? We're dealing with a virus pandemic.
Yeah.
Based on what's in the book and kind of what your research saw, are those cyber resilient companies also resilient to this virus in the way that things are transpiring here over the past few weeks? Are there lessons learned that we can take away on what works and what doesn't?
I think it's too early to tell. We don't have good data. We've got anecdotal data. And basically, companies seem to be falling into one of three boxes, at least the companies I've been consulting with. And the first box I call BYOD, where companies said, okay, you can work from home, just use your own home computer. And you'd be amazed at the regulated, large, sophisticated companies that had said, until the virus, had said never work from home, suddenly had to flip the switch and just went from a very secure environment to saying work from home on your home device. And you can just VPN from your home device into the company. Amazingly stupid, because most home devices are probably compromised. And they had no way of controlling the home devices. But they did it. So that's one category we saw. The second, so that was BYOD. The second category was what we call takeaway or carry out. We had one company that ripped out 500 desktops. 500 employees were told, just take them home. Now, the advantage of that, it's cumbersome, but the advantage of that is that those desktops were already imaged, already locked down, already had all sorts of things on them to secure them. What we found out, however, in that case, was the firewall rules are slightly different. When you're behind the corporate firewall, literally in the office, you take that same device, even with all the security features, home and operate from home, you got to change the firewall rules. And so we got hit right away, but contained. And the third kind of company we saw was what we call new buy. where we saw this threat of work from home coming, and we advised clients, go out now, buy a bunch of laptops, clean laptops, set up an assembly line, image them, lock them down so they can only do certain things, and put security endpoints on them, and be ready for the work from home. And then when it happened, they distributed them. That third kind of company that did a clean new build and lockdown of the desktop image, we think from the anecdotes we hear, that third kind of company is doing best in this environment.
So if I think about that for a second, I mean, anybody that's in a remote workforce kind of structure already is kind of in that third bucket, right? They've already issued laptops that have the appropriate endpoint security and controls in place.
Right.
And so they didn't have to do the procurement step. They were already in that step. They're kind of in that third bucket. And I tend to agree with you. People who are used to I've been working from Colorado since 2009 and traveled all around the world and the country. But I've always been in a remote way. So the transition for me wasn't a big deal because I'm used to it. But in remote workforces would already be in that situation as well. It's the other ones that were used to on-prem and had to transition to remote where those three buckets varied and struggles.
And that's the vast majority of people. I mean, you're lucky that you've always been able to work from home. Most people have not. The larger the organization they work for, the less likely it is that they've been able to work from home. And particularly organizations like financial organizations or financial related organizations, they had rules against work from home. And yet they had to do it really quickly. And they were caught flat-footed, most of them.
My concern in that is that I think the financials will fare better than state municipalities and state workers.
Well, they always do. I mean, let's face it, the states and the municipalities just don't have put in the money. And I always thought the Baltimore mayor was the best example of this. When the Baltimore municipal government got ransomed, the mayor said, well, I just don't have the money for cybersecurity. And I thought, that's like saying I don't have the money for water, or I don't have the money for electricity. These days, if you're running any organization, you have to pay for cybersecurity. It's the equivalent of electricity and water. You can't say it's something that you have to decide on whether or not you want it or not.
Do we need to change the way we threat model, Dick, today in terms of the Baltimore and similar municipalities ransomware attacks, the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing? I feel like it changes the way we should threat model. For example, where we talked earlier about how companies plan for maybe a 30% increase in people working from home, but never 100%, right? Do we start threat modeling for things like that and take it more seriously?
Yeah, well, it's a larger issue than just cybersecurity. The whole issue of worst case scenario planning. I've always advocated, whether it's cybersecurity or terrorism or anything else, that you envision the worst case. And you ask yourself, okay, what's really between me and the worst case? And there usually is something, right? That you've usually got some checks in place, some roadblocks in place. Then you take a look at them and you say, well, if I were a bad guy, or if I were just nature trying to mess things up, how could I get around those things that you have put in place? And try to get people to realize worst case scenarios happen all the time. And you can give them recent history examples in all sorts of fields of people saying, well, that would be a worst case. And then it happened.
Right. NotPetya certainly was that reality for quite a few companies.
Absolutely. So the book before Fifth Domain is a book called Warnings, which I wrote with R.P. Eddy. And we looked at 14 case studies, 7 in the past and 7 in the future, of people saying a worst case scenario was going to happen. And they were experts in their field, and they were ignored. And we asked the question in all of these 14 case studies, why were they ignored? One of the case studies, by the way, one of the future ones, was global pandemic. And it always came down to the same thing. The expert came into the boss or came into the decision maker with their hair on fire and said, you got to stop doing what you're doing. You got to stop your priorities. You got to stop your budget priorities and your program priorities. And you got to do what I want you to do, which is to act now to prevent something from happening, something that has really never happened before. And that never works.
No.
Even if you're an expert, and even if you have other experts on your side, if you're talking about something that has never happened before, a worst case scenario, bosses, decision makers, tend to satisfy. They either ignore you altogether, or fire you, or they make some minimal investment that really doesn't matter. And then the thing happens. And the cost of cleanup is usually 100, 1,000 times what the cost of prevention would have been.
Yep.
Now, it's interesting in this particular case, in the situation we're in, we're actually doing a little bit of that. The experts have come in with their hair on fire, and organizations have responded to the point where we've not completely shut down our economy, but pretty darn close in certain cases. I mean, this has been taken a lot more seriously, which has not happened in the other 14 use cases you were kind of talking through. I'm just curious how that global pandemic.
I don't agree. I think the time when the experts came in with their hair on fire was last year, the year before, 5 years before. And you can document that, saying that a global pandemic was going to happen and it was going to have these kinds of effects. And instead of doing all the things that we should have done to prevent it by ramping up spending, spending was actually reduced, and programs, warning detection programs were cut back, and emergency stockpiles and supplies were cut back rather than increased. So I think when this is all over and we have the inevitable, 9/11 Commission style report, we're going to find that this was exactly a case where experts knew it was happening, knew it was going to happen, and government at the highest levels ignored it. Now, not always. Past administrations had done some things, but this administration discontinued them.
Yeah, so you think I took this as we're kind of in a prevention mode, but we're not really. We're really in response mode, because prevention would have been years ago,
yes.
right? Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Very interesting. Paul, I don't know if you have any more questions for Dick. I mean, we could probably go on forever.
For a long time, yeah.
Yeah. Dick, if people want the book, The Fifth Domain, where should they go to get it?
Well, the answer to that I usually give is your local independent bookstores, because I want to support local independent bookstores. Many independent bookstores do have online ordering, and you can get The Fifth Domain through them. If your local independent bookstore doesn't have online ordering, obviously, go to Barnes and Nobles or Amazon online. And just for giggles, order the first book, Cyber War, from 10 years ago. Skim through that, and then jump ahead 10 years with The Fifth Domain.
Yeah, we can always learn from the past, right? That's pretty good.
Sometimes.
Dick, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.